Let's discuss three areas of action to promote well-being. The first is adult social and emotional learning and self-care. The second is collective care, or how we can work as a community to support one another and promote well-being. And the final area is organizational care. You may recall seeing this slide in an earlier VLS on care. It provides a definition of social and emotional learning from the Communities for Just Schools Fund. We know that SEL is essentially the process of developing emotional intelligence. Over time, and through ongoing research on its effectiveness, SEL has increasingly become understood as an important component to student well-being and success. We are also becoming increasingly aware of the need for adults to engage in our own ongoing social and emotional learning, which you see defined here as the process of helping educators build their expertise and skills to lead social emotional learning initiatives and to cultivate their own social and emotional competencies. Adult SEL includes the ability to positively model prosocial behaviors, label emotions, and demonstrate empathy, positive relationships, social and self-awareness to students and others. It also involves adult self-care practices to help educators cope with stress and manage their own emotions. We've talked about the many negative impacts of stress on educators and well-being. Research illustrates that adult social and emotional skills not only positively impact students, but also positively affect adult well-being. A few examples. Adults who recognize, understand, label, and regulate their emotions are less likely to report burnout, demonstrate higher levels of patience and empathy, encourage healthy communication, and create safe student learning environments. Research also suggests that teachers' social and emotional competency influences the quality of student-teacher relationships, classroom management, and overall school climate. And in schools where educators develop strong communication and trust, which are important SEL skills, teachers are reportedly more likely to learn from each other and stay in their profession. Practicing self-care can really enhance our social and emotional competencies, and it certainly contributes to our well-being. When we think of self-care, we typically define it as those practices or rituals that we use to reduce stress, cope with the challenges of work and life, enhance subjective sense of well-being, and replenish our energy levels. We also want to acknowledge what self-care is not. Ignoring the reality of our feelings, engaging in toxic positivity, or ignoring the realities in our world are in fact unhealthy for all of us. On a personal and communal level, our systems have a limited capacity to hold on to those feelings, thoughts, and experiences that we suppress until they actually become damaging to us physically and emotionally. And of course, looking beyond our role as educators, it's important to recognize that what impacts the world impacts us on some level, simply by virtue of our humanity. The concept of self-care has been around a long time. It has not only been used as a generic tool for good physical, mental, and emotional health, but as evidenced by this quote, it has also been thought about and used as a radical political act. Audre Lorde was an American writer, feminist, womanist, librarian, and civil rights activist. She wrote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." She spoke of this concept of self-care in the context of resisting and triumphing against systems that were dismissive of her and others who were marginalized by various systems because of their identities. She specifically battled against the healthcare system as she was also battling cancer. Ms. Lord also talked about, quote, "the devastating effects of overextension," end quote, pointing to systems that exhaust and overworked her and relying on communal support to overcome and resist the various systems that marginalized her and others like her. Take a few moments now to reflect on Ms. Lord's quote in relation to your own experience as an educator. Also, consider the quote in view of our current educational environment. Another action to promote well-being among educators is to foster collective care and community. Whereas self-care is focused inward on oneself, collective care and community are focused on strengthening authentic relationships and support systems inside and outside of the workplace, or working to dismantle systems that interfere with individual and collective well-being. Collective care may include engaging socially in our communities, providing and receiving support from family and friends. It may also include engaging in collective action or activities that benefit whole groups of people or communities. Connection with others is critical to our health and well-being. Collective care may historically have been prioritized more in communities that have been marginalized, minoritized, and oppressed. In this quote, Audre Lorde, whom we talked about earlier, spoke directly to Black women about self-care as a communal act that was necessary for survival. Consider how this quote applies to you, those in your social circle, and the staff in your school community. Lorde wrote, "Learning to consciously extend ourselves to one another and call on one another's strengths is a life-saving strategy. In the best of circumstances, we require an enormous amount of mutually consistent support to be able to look straight into the face of the powers aligned against us and still do the work with joy. It takes determination and practice." Embracing collective care shifts the focus away from solely individual one and recognizes a responsibility for the wellness of the entire community. It is also wellness-centered rather than focused on stress management. Here are some examples of structures that schools can put into place to foster collective care. They include staff circles, coordinated staff breaks, tap in, tap out, which is a form of respite for teachers during the school day, giving educators space to talk about their experiences, and ensuring that teachers and staff are included in decision making. I would also highlight the importance of our consciousness about colleagues whose identities and communities are typically marginalized. Be aware that typical racial and other cultural dynamics may interfere with feelings of inclusion and belonging. Now, let's turn our attention to assessment. In order to promote individual well-being, it may be useful to measure it. Colleagues at the Georgetown MedStar University Hospital System developed an online course to promote individual educator well-being called TeacherWise. Included in this free course is a measure of 5 domains of educator well-being called POISE. It includes the domains of physical, occupational, intellectual, spiritual, and emotional. Additional instruments include the ProQual, the Professional Quality of Life Scale, which measures compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue, the Educator Resilience and Trauma-Informed Self-Care Assessment and Planning Tool, tools for assessing social and emotional instruction and competencies, and one that assesses level of educator stress. These instruments can be good starting places for individual educators or entire school teams to consider where they are in areas of personal well-being and develop a plan for improvement. Now let's move beyond individual well-being and collective care to consider those organizational policies and practices that impact well-being. Our colleagues at Child Trends introduced the concept of organizational efforts to promote educator well-being by stating that while elements of the school environment and structure seem to cause considerable stress for teachers, the mechanisms commonly suggested to reduce teacher stress tend to focus on the teacher's responsibility for self-care. Self-care practices such as meditation, exercise, or participation in a support group are inexpensive and straightforward to implement, and certainly have the potential to alleviate symptoms of stress. However, these practices do not address the root causes of teacher stress and may divert attention from the systemic stressors that exist in schools today. Child Trends went on to say, any profession is bound to have its stresses, and teaching is no different. But when we accept that an unhealthy level of stress is inherent to teaching and place the burden of stress reduction on the individual teacher, we limit our ability to improve overall school wellness. We can better shape healthy schools for teachers and students by addressing the underlying causes of chronic stress and cultivating environments that promote teacher wellness. That's where organizational policies and practices to promote educator and school staff well-being come in. The Organizational Well-being Inventory for Schools is a tool that is being developed to assess the depth and quality of well-being that schools are providing for staff, systemically and structurally. It includes the 8 domains which you see on this slide: work, climate and environment, input, flexibility and autonomy, professional development and recognition, organizational and supervisory support, self-care, diversity, equity, inclusion and access, purpose and meaningfulness, and professional quality of life. Here's an example of one of the domains: work, climate, and environment. This domain represents the physical and emotional climate of an organization. It includes how well the physical space is maintained, as well as whether policies support a friendly and supportive work environment in which employee rights are clear and protected. There are several indicators that respondents can rate based on their perception of the degree to which each is implemented. We encourage you to review the OWBI for schools to determine those domains in which your school community is doing well and those that need the most improvement. Consider, how might you use this tool to advance organizational efforts to promote staff well-being? Lastly, appreciative inquiry is another approach to change that identifies and builds on what is already working well in an organization. This technique fosters optimism and collaboration. It also encourages the sharing of positive stories, which can change an organization's culture. As you complete this module, please take a few moments now to think about how you will use what you've learned to take action in your school.